Creatine for better memory. You may have heard this claim recently. So today, let's take a closer look at what's actually behind it. What's the science behind it? And as always, we'll jump right in after a quick intro. Stay tuned. My name is Dr. Fabian Mutach. I hold a PhD in biochemistry. I'm a German scientist and founder of Salventrix, dedicated to close the knowledge gap between science and your daily nutrition. And if you're interested in high-quality, science-based nutrition facts, then subscribe to this channel. And now, let's go back to the topic. Creatine is one of the most well-researched dietary supplements out there, at least when it comes to muscle building. Strength athletes in particular often use creatine, usually in the form of creatine monohydrate. And in this area, the effects of creatine are really well studied and they are supported by evidence. They are supported by scientific evidence. But one thing is important there. Creatine alone does not build muscle. I sometimes get this question. So keep in mind, creatine alone does not build muscle. You still need training and mechanical load. I often get asked whether creatine can rebuild muscle after illness without exercise, and the answer is certainly no. So creatine is not a miracle supplement, but it helps you to grow muscles if you do train. Creatine is actually a substance our body produces on its own, mainly in the liver, the kidneys, or the pancreas. So what does creatine do? That's important now for the further understanding. We need creatine to regenerate ATP. ATP is the most important energy carrier in the human body. Think of ATP as the fuel inside our cells, a general fuel. The more efficiently we regenerate ATP, the more energy our muscles have available. And that's why athletes can often produce more strength and maintain performance longer if they take additional creatine. Now, here comes the interesting part. ATP fuels all cells. It's a general fuel, not just for muscles. And while the brain makes up only about 2% of body weight, it consumes roughly 20% of our total energy. Think about that. Our neurons are incredibly energy hungry. So it seems reasonable to ask, could creatine also improve brain performance? And let's look at what research suggests here. Scientists generally separate findings into two main or major areas. First, effects on depression, and second, effects on cognitive performance. And let's start with depression. A large observational study in the United States followed up more than 20,000 people over 7 years. So a lot of people that were followed. And researchers analyzed how much creatine participants consumed and how often depression occurred in the different groups. So participants who consumed higher amounts of creatine showed lower rates of depression compared to those with lower intake. However, this only shows correlation, not causation. Now, there are also smaller clinical studies that really might actually be showing a causal effect. In one study, women with depression received either creatine or a placebo alongside an antidepressant. After 8 weeks, the group receiving creatine showed significantly better treatment outcomes. A similar result also appeared in another small study where cognitive behavioral therapy was combined with creatine supplementation. Again, symptoms improved more strongly in the creatine group. And even in healthy individuals, additional creatine may have noticeable effects, especially in three particular areas where we need to look at: short-term memory, attention span, and processing speed. At least that's what a meta-analysis evaluating 16 individual studies concluded. Vegetarians and vegans may benefit particularly from creatine supplementation. And honestly, that makes total sense. because vegetarians consume little creatine through food and vegans essentially none. So they rely entirely on the body's own creatine production. People under stress, especially those experiencing, for example, sleep deprivation, may also benefit. The reason for that is simple. Sleep loss reduces creatine phosphate levels in the brain, and supplemental creatine may help compensate for that decline. So that's one perspective. Now let's look at the regulatory perspective, at least the regulatory perspective in Europe. The European Food Safety Authority, the EFSA, currently evaluates the evidence quite differently. In its latest statement from November 2024, the agency rejected all health claims related to psychological or cognitive benefits of creatine. That means manufacturers, at least in Europe, are not officially allowed to advertise creatine as improving cognitive performance. The reason for that? Well, according to EFSA, the available data is still not convincing enough. The biological mechanisms are not fully understood yet, and most human studies included relatively small number of participants, sometimes only around 20 people per study group. And I would say ultimately everyone has to decide individually how much evidence they personally need before using creatine beyond muscle performance purposes. Whenever we talk about the benefits, we should also talk about the risks. And that's not fear-mongering, not at all. It's simply what I would call responsible evaluation. And here we need to say, fortunately, the risks of creatine are considered pretty low. A daily intake of 3 to 5 grams is generally regarded as safe. And current research shows no evidence of kidney damage in healthy individuals. Creatinine levels may increase during supplementation, but creatinine is simply a breakdown product of creatine and does not indicate kidney problems in this specific context. There's one exception. People with pre-existing medical conditions, especially kidney disease, they should consult their physician before using creatine. And as always, this video is intended for general education and information only. Okay, that was a lot of information, so let's briefly summarize. Creatine has long been successfully used to support muscle performance. Some research now also suggests its effects may extend beyond muscles and could potentially improve well-being and cognitive function, especially in certain groups. However, manufacturers, at least in Europe, are currently not allowed to promote these cognitive benefits because the scientific evidence is still considered insufficient, at least from a regulatory perspective. The positive studies were simply too small. And honestly, whether large clinical trials will ever happen is pretty uncertain, at least that is my opinion. Why is that? Because creatine is extremely inexpensive. You can buy 1 kilogram for under, let's say, $20, $25. At a daily intake of 3 to 5 grams, a month's supply only costs about $2 to $3. Yeah? At prices like that, it's difficult to finance large and pretty expensive clinical trials. And that means better data may never arrive. On the other hand, the safety of creatine is very well researched. So while the benefits are not fully proven, the risks also appear to be quite limited. And if you'd like to try creatine yourself, you'll also find product links in the video description. And I hope, of course, that you enjoyed this video, and I also hope that I'll see you again in the next video. Take care, I'm out for now. Thank you and bye. Dr. Fabian Mutach.